It was just another routine night for officers Jake Turner and Sarah Mills, two officers who had seen it all in their years on the force, or so they thought. They'd clocked in as they always did, patrolling the quiet streets of their beat, expecting another night of noise complaints and broken taillights. They had worked together for years and knew each other's rhythms and instincts, forming a partnership that felt like second nature. Tonight, they were more than prepared for whatever the usual shift might throw their way. But as the quiet hum of the city buzzed around them, something felt slightly off, an almost imperceptible feeling that neither could shake. Perhaps it was the unusually clear night sky, or the eerie silence that had settled over the empty streets. Jake kept one hand loosely on the steering wheel, the other resting just near the radio, while Sarah gazed out the window, her sharp eyes scanning the shadows cast by streetlights. The glow of the city lights danced across their cruiser, illuminating the empty buildings that lined their route, giving the night a strange sense of stillness. The tension was broken suddenly by a flash in the rearview mirror. A sleek, black SUV zoomed past them, moving at a speed that bordered on reckless, considering the quiet stretch of road it was tearing down. The vehicle practically glided through the night, barely making a sound, but moving far too fast to be ignored. Instinctively, Jake and Sarah exchanged a quick look, a silent agreement that this needed to be handled. In their line of work, things weren't always as they seemed, and even something as simple as a speeding car could unravel into a web of complications. With a flick of the lights and a quick press of the siren, Jake pulled the cruiser onto the road, the flash of red and blue lights cutting through the night. They accelerated to close the distance, and within moments, they were on the tail of the SUV. The driver must have noticed the flashing lights, as the SUV quickly began to slow down. Jake and Sarah prepared themselves mentally, running through the standard steps they'd practiced hundreds of times before. But as they approached the vehicle, something felt different. There was an intensity about this car, a feeling neither could quite put into words. Finally, the SUV came to a stop on the side of the road, its tinted windows reflecting the cruiser's lights, casting an almost ominous glow. Jake and Sarah exited the cruiser with practiced caution, their hands resting lightly on their belts. As they approached the driver's side window, Sarah's pulse quickened, though she couldn't quite explain why. She'd handled countless traffic stops before. She was calm, composed, and highly trained. But tonight, something in the air crackled with tension. Jake reached the window first, giving it a polite but firm knock. There was a slight pause, as though the driver were considering his options. And then, slowly, the window rolled down, revealing a face neither officer expected. The man sitting behind the wheel was dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, the kind that only high-ranking officials or wealthy businessmen seemed to wear. His hair was neatly combed back, and a faint scent of expensive cologne drifted from the open window. He was staring straight ahead, barely glancing at the officers, as though they were a mere inconvenience, a minor annoyance in his otherwise perfect night. His gaze was cold and unyielding, with an expression of mild disdain, as though he were sizing them up and finding them insignificant. Jake cleared his throat and began to speak. "Good evening, sir. Do you know why we pulled you over?" But before he could continue, the man interrupted, his voice low and dismissive. "Do you have any idea who I am?" he asked, raising a single eyebrow, his voice dripping with condescension. It wasn't a question so much as a statement, as though he were challenging them to recognize his importance. The way he said it sent a chill down Jake's spine, a sensation that he'd rarely experienced in his years on the force. It was as if the man believed he was untouchable. Sarah's gaze darted to the driver's license he handed over reluctantly, as if performing a task far beneath him. The name on the ID read, William Ashford. She felt a spark of recognition. She'd heard that name before, though she couldn't immediately place it. But Jake's face hardened as he looked at the license, the name igniting a memory from the whispered conversations in the precinct. William Ashford, the Deputy Director of Internal Affairs. His name had cropped up before, always with a sense of discomfort. Known for his ability to manipulate the system to his advantage, Ashford was a man with friends in high places and a talent for sweeping anything inconvenient under the rug. Jake and Sarah exchanged a glance, a silent conversation that said everything. Here, on the quiet streets they patrolled every night, was a man whose presence alone raised questions and stirred unease. William Ashford was not the kind of person they ever expected to encounter on a routine stop. People like him didn't live by the same rules as everyone else, or at least, that's what they believed. For a moment, silence filled the air as Jake and Sarah processed the situation. Ashford, seemingly bored, began tapping his fingers on the steering wheel, as if to hurry them along. His gaze slid lazily from Jake to Sarah, his smirk growing as he sensed their hesitation. He could practically taste the intimidation he was hoping to instill, the power dynamic he thought he controlled. But Sarah, ever the professional, kept her composure. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her falter. "Sir, regardless of your position, you were speeding well above the limit," she stated firmly, not allowing her voice to waver. She held his gaze, her expression unwavering. Ashford's smirk faded slightly, his amusement replaced by a flicker of annoyance. Without breaking eye contact, Sarah noticed something strange in the passenger seat, a black leather briefcase, barely visible in the shadows of the vehicle. It bore an official seal, one she recognized instantly. It was marked with the insignia of the Internal Affairs Department. The briefcase looked slightly ajar, and papers peeked out from the edges, as though hastily shoved inside. She exchanged a subtle look with Jake, her intuition kicking in. Something was off, and it wasn't just Ashford's arrogance. As the encounter stretched on, both officers felt a gnawing sense that this was no ordinary traffic stop. There was a story here, one layered with secrets and shadows. As Jake motioned for the driver to pull over, he and Sarah both braced themselves for what they thought would be a routine exchange. Just another speeding stop on an otherwise quiet shift. Their cruiser's flashing lights cast a surreal red and blue glow against the glossy black surface of the SUV as it slowed to a halt on the deserted street. The tension was thick, an almost tangible weight in the air that seemed to seep through the dark windows of the SUV. Jake took a steadying breath as they approached the driver's side, each step carrying an inexplicable sense of gravity. The moment the window began to roll down, Jake's instincts screamed at him that this wasn't going to be an ordinary stop. His usual, practiced greeting died on his lips as he locked eyes with the man in the driver's seat. There, staring back at him, was a pair of piercing, ice-cold eyes that seemed to dissect him with a single glance. The man looked utterly unfazed, almost bored, as though he was merely tolerating their presence. Dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, he exuded a level of self-assurance that didn't belong on these streets at this hour. The crisp fabric, the pristine white collar, the subtle glint of a high-end watch peeking from under his sleeve. Everything about him was precise, calculated. It was as if he had meticulously prepared himself for this exact moment, down to the last detail. Sarah noticed the man's raised eyebrow and the small, almost mocking smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. He looked less like someone who had been caught speeding, and more like someone indulging a tedious formality, as though the officers were mere nuisances, ants buzzing around his night. His gaze flicked between Jake and Sarah, sizing them up with a look that was both dismissive and somehow subtly menacing. He hadn't spoken a word, yet his entire demeanor screamed a single message. "I am above this. Above you." Finally, breaking the silence, the man spoke, his voice a low, sardonic drawl that seemed to hang in the air like a challenge. "Do you have any idea who I am?" He sneered, each word dripping with contempt. He didn't seem to expect an answer. His tone was laced with an arrogance so thick it was almost palpable. Jake, caught off guard, felt his jaw tighten instinctively, his professional calm straining under the weight of the man's disdain. This wasn't the reaction of a guilty driver fearing a ticket. This was someone who clearly believed he was untouchable. Without waiting for a response, the man reached into the pocket of his jacket, pulling out his license with an exaggerated slowness that felt almost insulting. His movements were calm, almost casual, as though he were performing some minor, tedious task beneath his dignity. He handed the license to Jake with a look of reluctant amusement, as though he found the whole situation mildly entertaining. Jake took the license, glancing down at the name, William Ashford. Instantly, a chill ran down his spine, one he couldn't entirely explain. He glanced at Sarah, catching her slight but noticeable shift in expression. The name was familiar, yet not from any casual mention. Both officers had heard it before, spoken in hushed tones around the precinct, carrying an unspoken weight. William Ashford. He wasn't just any high-ranking official. He was the Deputy Director of Internal Affairs, the kind of man who held sway over careers, the kind of man who had allies in places few dared to reach. Rumors had swirled around Ashford for years. Stories of his influence, his connections, his almost uncanny ability to make inconvenient issues disappear. When officers spoke of him, it was with a mix of wariness and begrudging respect. Ashford was a man who could make problems vanish with the stroke of a pen or a single phone call. He was known for wielding his position with a chilling efficiency, a reputation reinforced by whispers of deals cut behind closed doors, of buried reports, and investigations that mysteriously went cold. And now here he was, sitting in front of them on a deserted road, exuding a confidence that bordered on contempt. In his eyes, this was nothing more than an interruption to his night, a minor inconvenience handled with the same disregard one might show a stain on their suit. Sarah shifted beside Jake, her usually calm exterior faltering ever so slightly as she processed who they were dealing with. "Mr. Ashford," Sarah addressed him, her voice steady, but tinged with an edge of caution. "You were speeding well above the limit. I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle, please." Ashford's eyes narrowed slightly, his smirk fading as he took in Sarah's words. His hand hovered over the door handle, but he made no move to open it. Instead, he leaned back, crossing his arms with a sigh of exaggerated patience. "I don't think you understand," he replied smoothly, his voice now laced with an underlying warning. "I'm on my way to an important meeting. This detour you're insisting on is wasting both your time and mine." The dismissiveness in his tone hit Jake like a slap. They were being dismissed as if they were nothing, their authority treated as little more than an inconvenience. Jake felt his professionalism waver, and anger simmering beneath the surface. They had been trained to deal with all sorts of personalities, from the nervous to the defiant. But this was different. This was someone who genuinely believed that rules did not apply to him. "Sir," Jake interjected, his voice taking on a firmer edge, "we don't care who you are. Right now, you're just another driver who has broken the law. Now, please step out of the vehicle." For a moment, a flash of irritation crossed Ashford's face, quickly masked by his usual expression of cool indifference. Slowly, deliberately, he pushed open the door and stepped out, his movements languid, as though the entire affair were an inconvenience he was humoring out of sheer patience. As he stood, his towering frame seemed to loom over them, casting a shadow in the streetlight. He adjusted his cufflinks with a look of mild disdain, not even bothering to meet their eyes. "All right, officers," he said, his tone heavy with mock respect. "Let's get this over with, shall we?" His voice was low, dripping with sarcasm. The way he spoke, it was as though he were daring them to push him, to test the limits of their authority. Sarah held his gaze, refusing to be intimidated. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. But in her mind, questions whirled. Why was the Deputy Director of Internal Affairs driving alone in the dead of night, speeding down a deserted road? Why the air of secrecy, the dismissiveness, as if he had something to hide? She had seen her fair share of arrogance. But this felt different. There was a tension in the air, an undercurrent that seemed to suggest there was more beneath the surface, something darker. As Jake returned his attention to the ID, he felt a prickle of unease. A strange detail caught his eye, something small but out of place, a slight scuff on Ashford's otherwise pristine suit jacket. It was barely noticeable, but there. And for a man who seemed meticulous about his appearance, it stood out. He glanced at Sarah, who raised an eyebrow, having noticed it too. "Mr. Ashford," Jake began, choosing his words carefully, "is there something you'd like to tell us?" Ashford's smirk returned, but this time it was colder, more calculated. "Oh, officer," he replied, his voice dangerously soft. "I assure you, there's nothing you need to know." And with that, the tension in the night seemed to tighten around them, as if the darkness itself were holding its breath, waiting for what would happen next. The two officers stood side by side, every movement of theirs trained, cautious, careful. Though they were used to dealing with difficult drivers, William Ashford's presence was unlike anything they'd encountered. His sheer arrogance hung in the air like a bitter perfume, his body language exuding superiority, as though he considered himself beyond reproach. It wasn't just confidence. It was the quiet, cutting kind of disdain that only someone in power could wield, and he wielded it expertly. As the seconds stretched into uncomfortable silence, Ashford looked at the officers with barely concealed amusement. His gaze lingered on their uniforms, his lip curling slightly. "Must be thrilling," he said, the words drawn out, dripping with mockery. "Having such an important job, keeping the streets safe. I do commend your bravery." His smirk widened, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Jake clenched his jaw, the subtle twitch at the corner of his mouth betraying the irritation he was trying to contain. Sarah, on the other hand, kept her expression neutral, but her eyes were sharp, studying Ashford intently. There was a glint of something in his eyes. A challenge, perhaps, as though he wanted to see how far he could push them. It was almost as if he wanted to provoke them into losing their composure, like a predator playing with its prey before the final strike. "Mr. Ashford," Jake said, his voice level but firm, "we're here to do our jobs, and we expect full cooperation." He glanced at Sarah, sensing her unease. She was usually the calm one, the steadying force in their partnership, but tonight she seemed on edge. And Jake couldn't shake the feeling that her instincts were onto something. Ashford chuckled softly, folding his arms as he leaned back against his vehicle. "Oh, I have no doubt you're doing your job," he said with a smirk. "After all, who else would patrol these streets, if not the noble officers of—" He looked around with exaggerated disdain, as though the surroundings were somehow beneath him. "Well, whatever this place is." Sarah's patience was wearing thin. She'd dealt with arrogant men before, but this was different. There was a coldness to Ashford's words, a subtle menace that hinted at a deep-rooted belief that he was beyond the reach of ordinary consequences. She studied him closely, taking in every detail, the faint smudge on his collar, the barely noticeable fraying at the edge of his suit jacket, the way his hand rested protectively on the car door, as though guarding something precious. It was then that she noticed it. A sleek black briefcase sitting in the passenger seat, partially hidden under a leather jacket. But it wasn't just any briefcase. On its surface, she could make out the faint, embossed insignia of the department. And underneath that, a word that sent a shiver down her spine. "Confidential." Her eyes widened slightly, and she shot a quick glance at Jake, subtly inclining her head toward the briefcase. He followed her gaze, his brow furrowing as he took in the sight. The emblem was unmistakable, and the word beneath it left no room for doubt. This wasn't the sort of briefcase one would casually carry around on a late-night drive. It was the kind of item that belonged in secure offices, not tucked away in the front seat of an SUV speeding through the city. Ashford must have noticed their reactions, for his smirk grew sharper, his gaze turning icy. "Oh, is there something interesting in my vehicle, officers?" he asked, his tone mocking. "I wasn't aware that my possessions were a cause for public concern." Jake cleared his throat, trying to maintain his composure. "Mr. Ashford, may I ask what's in the briefcase?" His voice was steady, but there was an undercurrent of tension that even he couldn't completely hide. Ashford raised an eyebrow, a look of feigned innocence crossing his face. "A briefcase?" he asked, glancing at the passenger seat as though noticing it for the first time. "Oh, that. It's just some work documents. Not that it's any of your concern." His tone was casual, but there was a slight edge to his words, a defensive note that hadn't been there before. Sarah's eyes narrowed. "Documents from internal affairs," she pressed, her voice soft but unyielding. Ashford's gaze snapped to hers, and for the first time, his mask of indifference slipped, revealing a flash of irritation, quickly replaced by a cold smile. "Ah, Officer Mills, is it?" he said, glancing at her badge. "You seem perceptive, but I'm afraid you wouldn't understand the complexities of my work. It's not something the average patrol officer would comprehend." The way he emphasized her rank made her bristle, but she forced herself to remain calm. There was something here, something he didn't want them to see. She could feel it, a hidden layer beneath his words, a secret he was protecting with his every smug look and dismissive comment. "Mr. Ashford," Sarah said slowly, keeping her gaze steady, "we're simply trying to understand the situation. Your attitude and belongings are raising questions." Ashford laughed, a cold, humorless sound. "Questions?" he echoed, his voice laced with disdain. "Questions from you two?" He shook his head, as if the notion were absurd. "Let me be clear. I am not required to explain myself to a couple of street-level officers. Your badges may mean something to the citizens of this city, but to me they are irrelevant." He spat the last word, his eyes glinting with something almost feral. Jake's hand tightened around his flashlight, a sense of unease creeping into his bones. This wasn't the reaction of an innocent man caught speeding. Ashford was too defensive, too guarded, as though he had something to hide. And that briefcase, it was more than just a collection of work documents. Jake could feel it, a prickle of intuition whispering that they were on the verge of something far bigger than they'd anticipated. Meanwhile, Sarah's gaze lingered on the briefcase, her mind racing. Why would Ashford be driving around with sensitive documents in the dead of night? And why was he so dismissive, so eager to brush them off? She felt a familiar tug of suspicion, a gut feeling she'd learned to trust over the years. There was something here, something that didn't add up, and she was determined to find out what. Ashford must have sensed her resolve, for his smirk faded, replaced by a steely glint in his eyes. He straightened, his posture rigid, and for a moment, the air between them crackled with unspoken tension. "I would advise you both," he said slowly, his voice dangerously soft, "to remember your place." There was a threat hidden in his words, a warning that sent a chill down Sarah's spine. But she held his gaze, unflinching, refusing to be intimidated. Ashford may have held power within the department, but out here, on this quiet street, he was just another driver caught breaking the law, and she wasn't about to let him intimidate her into silence. "Mr. Ashford," Jake said, his voice calm but firm, "if there's nothing to hide, then you won't mind us taking a closer look. We're simply doing our duty." Ashford's jaw tightened, his hands clenching at his sides. For a moment, his calm facade slipped, and something dark flashed in his eyes, a glimpse of the man beneath the polished exterior. "Be very careful, Officer Turner," he said, his voice a low growl. "There are consequences to overstepping boundaries." Jake and Sarah exchanged a look, the silent understanding between them stronger than ever. They were in dangerous territory, standing on the edge of something that felt like a precipice. But neither was willing to back down. They'd come this far, and whatever secrets Ashford was hiding, they were determined to uncover them. As Jake and Sarah prepared to let Ashford off with a stern warning, their radios crackled to life, breaking the tense silence that had settled over the scene. It was dispatch, the voice on the other end carrying an urgency that made both officers pause. "Attention all units. Be advised, we have a high-priority report regarding a missing briefcase connected to an active investigation. It contains critical evidence, classified under restricted access. Last known to be in possession of Deputy Director William Ashford of Internal Affairs. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap, each syllable resonating with the weight of what it implied. Sarah's gaze shot to the briefcase in the passenger seat, the same one that had caught her attention earlier. Her mind raced, connecting the dots with a clarity that left her stunned. This wasn't just any piece of luggage. It was the briefcase, the one that had now been reported missing. And it was sitting right there, in plain sight, next to a man who had been taunting them, mocking their authority, and evading their questions. Ashford's smirk, which had been so steadfastly plastered on his face all evening, wavered, his confidence replaced by a flicker of something that looked suspiciously like panic. His eyes darted to the briefcase, then back to the officers, as if he were calculating his next move, assessing his options with growing desperation. "Would you mind stepping out of the vehicle, Mr. Ashford?" Jake's voice cut through the silence, his tone now steely and unyielding. It was no longer a request, but a command, one backed by a newfound authority. Whatever deference or restraint they might have shown before was gone. The officers were now firmly in control, and Ashford could sense it. Ashford's smirk disappeared entirely, replaced by a hardened expression. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles turning white. "This is ridiculous," he scoffed, but there was a slight tremor in his voice that betrayed him. "I'm the Deputy Director of Internal Affairs. I outrank you. I don't answer to you." Sarah stepped forward, her eyes narrowing as she studied him, her earlier unease now replaced by a steely determination. "Deputy Director or not, Mr. Ashford, you're in possession of classified evidence reported missing." "That makes it our business," she replied firmly. Ashford opened his mouth to protest, but he seemed to realize that he was out of options. Slowly, reluctantly, he stepped out of the vehicle, his movements tense and unwilling. The self-assured arrogance that had once cloaked him seemed to have evaporated, leaving behind a man who was clearly uncomfortable, maybe even afraid. Sarah exchanged a quick glance with Jake, and together they turned their attention to the briefcase. The weight of the moment was palpable. They were about to cross a line, one that would either confirm their suspicions or, potentially, destroy their careers if they were wrong. But they couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something deeply wrong was happening here. They had to see it through. "Open it," Jake said, his voice barely more than a whisper, though it carried a resolute firmness. Sarah reached for the briefcase, her hand steady despite the racing of her pulse. She undid the latch, and the top of the briefcase swung open with a soft click, revealing its contents. Inside, neatly organized but unmistakable, were files, documents, and photographs. They were labeled with case numbers, stamped with red ink that read QONFID and arranged in such a meticulous manner that it was clear this wasn't a haphazard collection of papers. These were documents that had been carefully curated, selected for a purpose. At first glance, they seemed innocuous enough. Pages of financial records, contracts, official memos. But as Sarah's eyes skimmed over the text, the gravity of what they were looking at began to dawn on her. Jake leaned in, his face hardening as he began to make sense of what he was seeing. "These are bank statements," he murmured, his voice laced with disbelief. "Transfer records, account details." He paused, his eyes widening as he took in the names listed alongside each transaction. These were names they recognized, names of officials within the department, politicians, even known figures in organized crime. Each document was a breadcrumb, a link in a chain that led to something massive. But there was more. Alongside the financial records were emails, correspondence between officials, some of whom had signatures that made Jake and Sarah's blood run cold. These were people who wielded influence over every corner of the city, from law enforcement to city hall. This is evidence of corruption," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. Her hands trembled slightly as she turned to the next document. It was a letter, a formal request for a substantial bribe, disguised as a campaign donation. It was signed by a high-ranking official, one she knew all too well. Ashford's face turned a shade paler, his eyes darting between the briefcase and the officers. The look of disdain he'd once worn had been replaced with one of sheer terror. "This is a misunderstanding," he stammered, though his voice was hollow, lacking conviction. "Those documents were planted. Someone's trying to frame me." But his words rang empty. His demeanor, his actions, and his evasive responses throughout the night had already painted a different picture. This was no innocent man caught up in a misunderstanding. This was someone who had been cornered, and he knew it. "Mr. Ashford," Jake said, his tone no longer courteous or restrained, "you're going to have to come with us." He reached for his handcuffs, a gesture that sent Ashford into a frenzy. "Wait." Ashford's voice rose, his usual calm replaced by a panicked edge. "You don't understand. This goes beyond me. If you arrest me, you're putting your own lives at risk. Do you think people in my position work alone? There are others, people far more powerful than you realize." But Jake was undeterred. "So you're admitting you're part of this?" Ashford's mouth opened and closed, as though he were struggling to find the right words. For the first time, he looked truly vulnerable, a man who was seeing his world crumble before him. He took a step back, his hands raised in a desperate attempt to reason with them. "Look," he said, his voice a harsh whisper, "you don't know what you're getting into. These files implicate people who would do anything to protect themselves. If you pursue this, you're risking more than just your jobs." Sarah's face hardened. "That's a risk we're willing to take," she replied coldly. "We took an oath to uphold the law, Mr. Ashford, and that includes holding people like you accountable." Realizing he was out of options, Ashford's shoulders slumped. The arrogance that had once defined him had dissolved, leaving behind a man who looked exhausted, defeated. He offered no further resistance as Jake cuffed him, though his eyes still held a glint of bitterness, as though he resented them for daring to bring him down. As they led him back to the cruiser, the weight of what they'd uncovered settled heavily on their shoulders. This wasn't just a case of corruption. It was a web of deceit that stretched across the highest levels of power in the city. They had stumbled upon something far larger than themselves, something that would undoubtedly send shockwaves through the department and beyond. But as they placed Ashford in the back of the cruiser, Jake and Sarah exchanged a glance, a silent understanding passing between them. They were prepared for whatever consequences might come. They had done the right thing, and that was all that mattered. The drive back to the station was filled with a tense silence, punctuated only by the soft hum of the engine. In the rearview mirror, Jake could see Ashford staring out the window, his expression unreadable. But as they neared the station, he finally spoke, his voice low and defeated. "You have no idea what you've just unleashed," he muttered, his words barely audible. "This isn't over. Not by a long shot." But Jake and Sarah weren't intimidated. They had uncovered the truth, and they would see it through, no matter the cost. The city deserved justice, and they were prepared to fight for it, even if it meant taking on the very system they had once trusted. And as they parked the cruiser outside the station, they knew that their lives, and the lives of countless others, would never be the same again. As Ashford was pulled from his sleek SUV and handcuffed by the arriving officers, his face was a contorted mask of anger, disbelief, and the bitter realization that his years of untouchable arrogance had come crashing down around him. He looked around as if expecting someone, anyone, to come to his rescue, to stop this farce, and restore him to the pedestal he had so carefully constructed. But there was no one. All he had left were his own pitiful excuses, which he threw at the officers in rapid succession, each one more desperate than the last. "This is all a misunderstanding," he shouted, his voice rough and hoarse with frustration. "Do you know who I am? I'm the Deputy Director of Internal Affairs. I outrank you all." His words, once infused with authority, now sounded hollow, frantic. The officers, unimpressed and unmoved, continued reading him his rights, their voices calm and detached, as if dealing with any other suspect. But Jake and Sarah weren't just dealing with any suspect. This was a man who had spent years hiding behind his title, using it to intimidate, to silence, to manipulate others into submission. And now, standing by the side of the road with his hands bound and his gaze wild, he was finally stripped of that power. Jake and Sarah exchanged a look, a shared sense of triumph and relief flooding through them. This was justice, the kind that transcended the mere act of making an arrest. It was the satisfaction of knowing that they had held a corrupt figure accountable, someone who had used his position to undermine the very system he was supposed to uphold. As Ashford was placed in the back of a squad car, his shouting grew fainter, gradually replaced by a sullen silence as he stared out the window, his gaze unfocused. Jake and Sarah watched as the car pulled away, carrying with it a man who had once been untouchable. But this was just the beginning. The following days were a whirlwind of investigations, revelations, and consequences. Once Ashford was in custody, he faced relentless questioning by an independent team brought in to handle the case. Jake and Sarah were called in to give their testimonies, recounting every detail of their encounter with Ashford, from the moment they had pulled him over to the discovery of the briefcase. Their statements, combined with the trove of incriminating documents found in Ashford's possession, painted a damning picture. The files inside the briefcase were only the tip of the iceberg. With further examination, investigators discovered connections to a vast network of corruption that spanned multiple government offices, influential business entities, and even elements within law enforcement. High-profile names were linked to illicit deals, off-the-record donations, and covert alliances that spanned years. The city, it seemed, was steeped in a culture of deception that stretched far beyond what anyone had suspected. Ashford's role was crucial. He was the orchestrator, the linchpin who held these disparate pieces together, operating in the shadows, ensuring that no one ever pulled too hard at the threads. But now that he was under scrutiny, the web he had woven began to unravel. One by one, individuals connected to Ashford were brought in for questioning. Some cooperated, hoping for leniency, while others clung stubbornly to their silence, certain that their reputations and connections would protect them. But with every new testimony and piece of evidence, the walls closed in further. The city was transfixed as daily news reports covered each new arrest, each stunning admission of guilt, painting a vivid picture of a city administration tainted by greed and power. Jake and Sarah became unwitting heroes in the eyes of the public. Reporters swarmed them for interviews, eager for a glimpse into the lives of the two officers who had dared to stand up to corruption. Though they declined most of the attention, preferring to remain grounded in their work, they couldn't ignore the profound impact of their actions. Their story inspired others to speak out, and whistleblowers began coming forward, sharing their own experiences and adding fuel to the investigation. The case quickly gained momentum, with Ashford's former allies scrambling to cover their tracks. Some attempted to cut deals, hoping to mitigate their sentences, while others went underground, disappearing from the public eye. But there was no escaping the reckoning that was coming. Ashford had once been a man who instilled fear in others, but now he was the one living in fear. Fear of the consequences, fear of the betrayals he had once so easily commanded. Months passed as the evidence piled up, leading to one of the most highly anticipated trials in the city's history. William Ashford was at the center of it all, facing a staggering list of charges, from bribery and embezzlement to obstruction of justice and conspiracy. He appeared in court each day, his once confident demeanor replaced by a hollow, haunted look. Gone was the arrogance, the smug superiority that had once defined him. In its place was a man who had finally been forced to confront the consequences of his actions. Jake and Sarah were present at the trial, sitting quietly in the back row, observing as witness after witness took the stand. They listened as former colleagues and associates described how Ashford had manipulated them, exploited their fears, and coerced them into silence. Some spoke with anger, others with remorse, but all were united in their condemnation of the man who had orchestrated this web of corruption. At one point, Jake and Sarah were called to testify, their roles as the officers who had made the initial arrest lending a unique weight to their words. They recounted the night of Ashford's arrest, their discovery of the briefcase, and the subtle but unmistakable fear they had seen in his eyes. Their testimonies were clear, concise, and unyielding, a stark contrast to Ashford's evasive responses and deflections. The prosecution laid out their case with meticulous detail, presenting the evidence they had gathered from Ashford's files, bank statements, and correspondences. They painted a vivid picture of a man who had used his position not to serve the public, but to line his own pockets and protect his powerful friends. The jury listened intently, their expressions growing increasingly grim as the extent of Ashford's deceit became clear. When it came time for the defense, Ashford's lawyers attempted to paint him as a victim, a man who had been misunderstood and misrepresented by those who were eager to bring him down. But their arguments fell flat, met with skepticism and disbelief. The evidence was irrefutable, and the witnesses, many of whom were once Ashford's allies, left no room for doubt. After weeks of testimonies, cross-examinations, and closing arguments, the jury deliberated. It didn't take long. Within hours, they returned with a verdict, guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of relief and satisfaction as Ashford was led away, his face a mask of resignation. The fallout from the Ashford case reverberated throughout the police department and beyond. High-ranking officials who had once wielded their power with impunity found themselves under intense scrutiny. Policies were overhauled, new checks and balances were implemented, and a wave of retirements and resignations swept through the department. A new era of transparency was ushered in, one that prioritized accountability and ethical standards over loyalty to those in power. Jake and Sarah watched as their department transformed, the corrupt few replaced by individuals who were committed to serving the public. It wasn't an easy transition. There was resistance, resentment, and no shortage of backlash. But the department persevered, buoyed by the determination of officers who were tired of seeing their work tarnished by the actions of a select few. Both Jake and Sarah were promoted, their bravery and dedication recognized by their superiors. But for them, the real reward was knowing that they had made a difference, that they had taken a stand when it mattered most. They continued their work with a renewed sense of purpose, their experiences serving as a constant reminder of the importance of integrity and accountability. As time passed, the city began to heal from the scars left by Ashford's betrayal. The public regained trust in its officials, reassured by the reforms that had been implemented and the transparency that had been promised. Jake and Sarah became mentors to younger officers, sharing their story and instilling in them the values that had guided them through the darkest moments of their careers. Their actions had sparked a movement, a call for justice that extended beyond the boundaries of their city. Other departments and government agencies took note, inspired by their courage and commitment to the truth. The legacy of the Ashford case was one of hope, a reminder that even in the face of corruption and deceit, there were those who would fight for what was right. Jake and Sarah's lives had been forever changed by that fateful night, but they wouldn't have had it any other way. They had seen the impact of their actions, the ripple effect that had spread far beyond their initial arrest of William Ashford. And though the journey had been difficult, filled with challenges and sacrifices, they knew that they had made a lasting difference. In the end, they were not just officers who had uncovered a corrupt official. They were symbols of resilience, integrity, and the unwavering pursuit of justice. And as they continued their work, they carried with them the knowledge that they had helped to create a better, more just world, one arrest, one truth at a time. In the quiet of the precinct, as the echoes of the case's impact still reverberated through the city, Jake and Sarah sat side by side, reflecting on the journey that had brought them here. It was late, well past the hour when most had gone home, but neither felt like leaving just yet. There was something sacred about this moment, a sense of closure that seemed almost too profound to break. They had just returned from a ceremony where they were formally recognized by the city, given medals for bravery, integrity, and dedication. The honors felt surreal, as if they were bestowed upon different people. But perhaps they were different, changed by the course of events that had begun on that seemingly routine night. Sometimes, those who sit at the highest places fall the hardest, Jake murmured, breaking the silence. His voice was reflective, almost soft. The phrase had become a sort of unofficial motto in the aftermath of the Ashford case, an embodiment of the lessons they had learned and the values they now held dear. He glanced at Sarah, who nodded, her expression distant as she considered his words. "Yeah," she replied thoughtfully, and it wasn't just him. It was everyone who thought they could get away with it. Everyone who saw their power as a shield against accountability. She paused, the weight of her words settling in the space between them. "I never realized just how deep it went, or how many people were involved. It's humbling, you know, knowing that we had a part in bringing it to light." Jake nodded, his thoughts drifting back to that night. The scene was burned into his memory. The briefcase, the confrontation, the cold look of defiance in Ashford's eyes. But more than that, it was the sense of purpose that had driven them, the unshakable belief that they were doing the right thing, no matter the risk. That belief had carried them through the darkest moments of the investigation, through the uncertainty, the backlash, and the threats. It had given them the strength to stand firm, to see the case through to the end. They had been called heroes, celebrated as the officers who had taken down a powerful figure. But for Jake and Sarah, it wasn't about the accolades or the recognition. It was about something far more profound, the knowledge that they had helped restore faith in the system they had sworn to uphold. The case had become a beacon of hope, a reminder that even in a world marred by corruption and deceit, there were those who would stand up for justice, who would fight to hold people accountable, no matter how high they might climb. As the city moved forward, the impact of their actions continued to unfold. Reforms were implemented, policies re-examined, and leaders held to new standards. The case had ignited a movement, a call for transparency and integrity that resonated far beyond the borders of their city. Other departments took notice, inspired by the courage and commitment of two ordinary officers who had refused to be intimidated. In the years that followed, Jake and Sarah's legacy endured. They became mentors to younger officers, sharing their story and instilling in them the values that had guided them through the storm. They taught them that bravery wasn't about physical strength or daring stunts. It was about standing up for what was right, even when it was difficult, even when it meant going against those in power. It was about integrity, resilience, and the unyielding pursuit of justice. For Jake and Sarah, the experience was transformative. It had shown them the power of their role as officers, the potential they held to make a difference, to impact lives, to shake the world around them. They had always known that their job was important, that they were there to protect and serve. But this was something else entirely. It was a calling, a purpose that transcended the daily routines and challenges of law enforcement. It was a reminder of the profound responsibility they bore and the privilege of standing on the side of truth. Sometimes they wondered about the legacy they would leave behind. Would people remember them as the officers who had taken down a corrupt figure? Would their actions inspire others to stand up for what was right, to fight against injustice? They hoped so. They hoped that their story would serve as a testament to the power of courage, the strength of conviction, and the importance of integrity. In the quiet moments, when the adrenaline faded and the weight of their actions settled in, they found comfort in the knowledge that they had made a difference. They had stood up to someone who thought they were untouchable, who had used his power to manipulate, to deceive, to evade accountability. And in doing so, they had reminded the world that the law was meant for all, that no one was above it, no matter how high they might climb. As they prepared to leave the precinct, Jake looked at Sarah, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Think they'll remember us?" Sarah chuckled, her eyes soft with reflection. "Maybe. But if they do, I hope it's not just for what we did. I hope it's for what we stood for." With that they rose, their footsteps echoing softly in the empty halls. Their journey wasn't over. There would be new challenges, new battles, new moments that would test their resolve. But they were ready. They had faced the darkness, confronted the corruption, and emerged stronger, more resolute. They had become symbols of resilience, of justice, of the unwavering belief that truth would always prevail. And as they walked into the night, they carried that belief with them, a guiding light in the uncertain road ahead.